I want you to picture a doorway cut into the side of a small hill behind an Amish farmhouse in Holmes County, Ohio. It is the third week of August. The thermometer on the porch reads 91 degrees, and when you step down into that doorway, the air that meets your face is 55 degrees. No compressor, no wires, no box humming outside the wall, just cool, steady air rising out of the ground like the house itself is breathing. The first time I felt it, I stood there waiting for a fan to kick on somewhere. It never did, because there was nothing to kick on. That cool air came straight out of the earth through a system that costs about $300 in materials and runs on a fan that pulls less power than your reading lamp. The Amish have been building some version of this for more than 200 years. The cooling industry has understood the science behind it since the 1930s. And in the 1930s, a single sentence written into a single corporate manual made sure your builder, your contractor, and your father's contractor would never offer it to you. After my last video, the same question kept coming back. What about July, folks asked, when the power bill triples? So I drove back to Holmes County to find out. And what I found under those farmhouses is the same trick the Persians used to freeze ice through 120-degree desert summers 2,400 years ago. And before you decide this only works on a brand new house in the country, it does not. This works under a house built in 1970 on a quarter-acre lot. Stay with me, because the part that applies to your house specifically is coming, and it is the part nobody selling you an air conditioner will ever mention. If you are the kind of person who believes that real, practical knowledge gets quietly shelved the moment it threatens somebody's profit, then you already know what to do. Subscribe, because there is more of this every single week. Now let me give you the one number that this entire system rests on. Go down 6 feet into the ground anywhere in the country, and the temperature of the soil stops moving. It locks. It holds that same reading in January and in July, at noon and at midnight. The Department of Energy's own laboratory at Oak Ridge measured this city by city across the whole country. In the upper Midwest, the ground holds in the low 50s. Across the southern states, it settles into the low 60s. And right there in Holmes County, where those Amish farms sit, the soil a few feet down stays close to 54 degrees every day of the year. It simply does not change. Sit with that for a second, because it is stranger than it sounds. Your air conditioner fights the heat by squeezing chemical refrigerant through coils, blowing your indoor air across those coils and dumping the leftover heat out into your yard. For every unit of electricity it burns, it moves maybe 3 units of heat. Engineers call that ratio a coefficient of performance, just a way of saying how much cooling you get back for the power you spend. An air conditioner sits around 3. A buried pipe running air through cool ground has been measured many times higher. The gap between those two figures is not small. It is billions of dollars a year in equipment, refrigerant, repair calls, and replacement units. And that gap is the entire reason this was kept off your radar. Here is why the ground behaves this way in plain terms. Dirt is heavy. A single cubic foot of soil can weigh well over 100 pounds. And to shift the temperature of all that mass by even 1 degree takes an enormous amount of energy. So when the August sun bakes the surface, that heat does sink downward, but it crawls. It takes weeks to work its way down a few feet. By the time the summer heat finally reaches 6 feet, the season has already turned and fall is pulling it back out. The deep soil never gets the chance to warm up. It is the largest battery for temperature on the planet, and it is sitting under your lawn doing absolutely nothing because no one ever told you it was there. The Amish did not learn this from a textbook or government pamphlet. They learned it the way they learn most things, by watching what the land was already doing and then building to match it. Walk onto almost any old order farm and you will find a root cellar dug deep into the earth. No insulation, no machinery, holding steady just above freezing through the hottest week of the year. That is not folklore. That is applied physics, refined by trial and error across 6 or 7 generations. Then there are the spring houses. These are little stone buildings set directly over a flowing spring, where groundwater comes up at a constant 54 degrees. The water runs through a channel under the floor, and the whole building stays cool enough to keep milk and butter fresh with no ice and no electricity. I stepped inside one on a 91-degree day and could see my own breath. Outside, it felt like an oven. Inside, like a cellar in October. But the piece that matters most for what we are talking about today is something the families I visited call the breadth of the floor. Clay pipes laid in the ground beneath the foundation before the house ever went up. Outside, air is drawn in, travels through those buried pipes, gives up its heat to the cool earth along the way, and rises through the floorboards already chilled. There is a Department of Agriculture document from 1903 that describes this exact arrangement, clay pipe cooling in Ohio farmhouses. That paper is over 120 years old. The system it describes is still running under Amish homes today, no parts replaced, no power drawn, And this is the part of the story that started to bother me, because the families who carried this knowledge to Ohio and Pennsylvania came from Germany and Switzerland. And those two countries are the world leaders in modern buried air cooling today, with monitoring programs and university studies behind them. One engineering school in Zurich tracked a system like this for 15 years and found almost no drop in performance. The knowledge the Amish carried across the ocean 200 years ago is the same knowledge Europe is now treating as cutting-edge engineering. The circle closed. America just never got the memo because somebody made sure it never went out. Quick question before we go on, because I genuinely want to know. Drop your state in the comments and tell me what you paid to cool your home last summer. I read every single one of these, and your answers are what decide which systems I dig into next. And if you have made it this far with me, go ahead and subscribe, because what is coming up is the part the cooling industry would much rather you never saw. Now, back to it. So how does a system this simple, this cheap, this durable disappear from an entire country? It did not vanish on its own. In 1902, a man named Willis Carrier built the first mechanical air conditioner. And here is the detail most people miss. He did not build it to keep people comfortable. He built it to pull moisture out of the air in a printing plant so the paper would stop warping. Human comfort was an afterthought that came later, once his company realized how much bigger that market was. By the 1920s, Carrier's Corporation was running a national campaign to sell the idea that mechanical cooling was the mark of a modern, clean, successful American home. And their own materials, which still exist and which you can read, describe the old passive methods, the buried pipes and the cellars, as primitive. Then, in 1930, an engineering manual put out by that same company included one line stating that earth contact cooling was suitable only for cellars and cold storage. One sentence. And with it, thousands of years of working knowledge quietly walked out of American home building and never came back. And it was not an accident. In the late 1920s, the first model building codes were being drafted, and the rooms where those codes got written were full of representatives from the mechanical cooling industry. The passive methods were never formally banned. They simply were not written into the document. And if a method is not in the code, a building inspector has no box to check for it, a contractor has no line to bid on it, and a bank has nothing to finance. It disappears, not because it failed, but because the paperwork has no place to put it. After the Second World War, the building boom locked mechanical cooling in as the only accepted way to cool a home, and passive methods vanished from the architecture schools. A whole generation of builders and inspectors came up in a world where the buried pipe might as well not exist. Not because it stopped working, but because there was no money in a system that, once installed, never needs to be sold again. And the numbers make the motive plain. The residential cooling market is worth tens of billions a year, and the manufacturer's trade group spends tens of millions on political activity annually. Think about what one buried system means to them. It is an air conditioner never sold, a compressor that never burns out, a refrigerant charge never topped off, a service contract never signed. Multiply that across a country, and you understand why this stayed buried. Here is where it gets pointed. In recent years, an engineering committee responsible for evaluating exactly these kinds of systems was asked to create an approval pathway for buried air cooling. They turned it down, citing a lack of domestic performance data, while across the ocean, Europe had decades of monitored installations sitting right there. When researchers looked at who actually sat on that committee, a clear majority were tied to the cooling manufacturers themselves. The people writing the rules were the same people selling the boxes. And the building code section that governs ductwork assumes, right there in the language, that all ducts live inside the building. A pipe buried in the ground does not fit the template, so it cannot be approved. Not because it is unsafe, because the form has no line for it. Meanwhile, the proof is everywhere if you know to look. A public library in Massachusetts runs dozens of these tubes and uses roughly half the energy of a comparable building. A hospital in Vienna has cooled patient wings with buried air since the 1990s. Decades of continuous service. These are not experiments, they are working infrastructure. Your building inspector has simply never heard of them because the exam he passed never mentioned them. Now here is the part I promised you. If you already own your home and you have been sitting there thinking this only helps people pouring a fresh foundation, stay with me because this next part is built specifically for you. You do not need to tear up your slab. You do not need to touch your existing system. You need a strip of yard, even a narrow one running along a fence line, even a side yard the width of a parked car. Here is the shape of it for a house that already exists. You dig a trench about 6 feet down along whatever run of land you have. Into that trench, you lay smooth walled pipe, 6 to 8 inches across, in a run of 100 to 200 feet. Smooth walled is not a suggestion. Ribbed pipe traps moisture in every groove and grows mold, so it has to be smooth on the inside. You bed the pipe in sand so it makes good contact with the earth. And you give it a gentle slope, about 2%, running toward a low drain point, so any moisture that forms inside runs out instead of pooling. One end rises above ground at an intake with a screen. The other end comes into the house through a basement or crawl space wall, passes through a good filter, and connects to a small inline fan drawing somewhere between 50 and 80 watts. What comes out the far end is outside air that has traveled a couple hundred feet through Earth locked at the mid-50s. On a 95-degree afternoon, that air leaves the pipe somewhere in the mid-60s. And it is not just cooler, it is drier, because moisture condenses against the cool pipe walls on the way through. The materials run a few $100s. The fan sips power like a single light bulb. And the pipe outlasts you, while the central unit it replaces ends up in a landfill inside 20 years. Now, I owe you an honest word, because this is where real caution matters, and I will not gloss over it. A buried air pipe can develop condensation, mold, or in certain soils, a radon problem, and that risk is genuine. It has to be managed, not waved away. So in a damp southern climate, or anywhere you're unsure about your soil, there's a smarter and safer version. Instead of running the household air through the buried pipe, you run a sealed loop of water mixed with the same glycol that goes in your car radiator. That liquid circles down through the buried pipe, picks up the Earth's steady temperature, and passes through a small heat exchanger indoors. No outside air ever touches the buried pipe at all, no condensation worry, no mold worry, no radon worry. And because it is plumbing rather than air handling, it slides cleanly under the rules every state already has. Before you build anything, talk to a professional, test your soil, and follow your local codes. I mean that. And now the piece I held back for the end, the one that put 4 hours on my truck to go see it. The man lives in rural Tennessee, in an ordinary house from the 1970s. His summer cooling bill used to run well over $200 a month. A few years ago, he built the sealed glycol version, but he did something clever. He buried the loop under his workshop, a short walk from his back door, trenched it himself over 2 weekends, and tied it into a small fan unit he bought online. In summer, it pulls heat out of his house into the cool ground. In winter, it does the reverse. One loop, both seasons, for almost nothing. And here is the detail that stuck with me. He never disconnected his old furnace or air conditioner. They are still bolted to the wall, ready. He just stopped turning them on. If the loop ever needed work, he could switch back in 5 minutes. There is no risk, no commitment. Just a man who stopped paying $200 a month because he understood what the dirt under his shop was already doing for free. Everything I walked through here, the buried system, the safe-sealed version, the exact materials and sizing, I put in one place with the other Amish home systems I have covered. It is in the description if you want it. But stay right here, because the ending matters. Because this is knowledge that belonged to everyone once. The Persians cut cooling channels into the desert. The Romans ran air under their villa floors. Farmers across Europe dug cellars that held steady through every season. The Amish simply never let go of it. They carried it across an ocean and kept building it, generation after generation, because it worked and because they never needed anyone's permission to do the thing that made sense. In 1930, one sentence in one company manual decided you would never be offered this. A committee stacked with the right people kept it out of the code. But the ground beneath your house does not care about manuals or committees or quarterly earnings. It sits at the mid-50s. It always has. And it will still be sitting there long after every air conditioner ever built has rusted into nothing. The knowledge was never lost. You were just never given it, and now you have it. So tell me, drop your state in the comments, and tell me what you pay to cool your home in summer, and tell me whether you have any land around your house, even a strip the width of a car along a fence line, because that is all this takes. And if your grandfather ever kept a spring house or a root cellar that held food cold without a watt of power, I genuinely want to hear about it, because that knowledge and this system are the very same physics. They just gave it a different name. I read every single one. Hit subscribe, because next week I'm going to show you the Amish water system that brings clean water up out of the ground with no pump, no electricity, and no fuel of any kind, using a method the authorities tried to rule out of compliance back in 2012. They did not succeed, and the reason they failed is a story you're going to want to hear.